This video is going to be a little bit different. This is definitely a talking heads. I apologize for the webcam quality for this intro part. This is an HP. This is my new editing laptop. I'm letting the Dell go to a friend of mine who needs it more than I do. And I get a little bit of a CPU upgrade and maybe some graphics that can game over the old Quadro. So that is what it is. But that's not what this is about. We will touch on this machine for a second because it's sort of ironic where I'm recording this video from, given my stance on the subject. So with that, we'll just get into that, all right? So if I switch scenes, you will see that I am on a 17-inch HP Envy laptop. This machine in particular, I picked up from my brother, who got it from somebody. It's about 3 years old. It needed a whole go through. It needed thermals. It just needed a once over. That lady ended up just going and buying a new machine because that's what she does. And I'm not that person, so I ended up purchasing this off of him to use for editing. This machine was quite an upgrade for me in the CPU department. And since I don't pay for Resolve, and I still do a lot of editing in Kdenlive as well, and Resolve, I needed more CPU than my old editing machine, which was like a 6th gen i7. This is faster. The NVIDIA graphics is kind of a mid. I don't have any encoders, which is unfortunate. But in terms of GPU acceleration, this GPU is so much faster, it's not even funny. For what the guy I'm selling it to is going to use it for, he pays for Resolve. I'll let you guess who it is. And he'll get to be able to use those encoders just fine. He'll have a perfectly good time editing video on it. But the point of this video isn't to talk about this machine. It's to talk about Wayland and how the rollout's being handled and my kind of opinion on it. Now, it may surprise you. Yes, I am recording from an X11 machine because I use Linux Mint, as I've made pretty obviously clear on the channel before, and I might be a little bit of a shill for it. It's hard for me not to because it works so good for me. So why wouldn't I recommend it to other people? This isn't always the case for everybody, but it is for me, and that's my take on it. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but let's go ahead and transition into the topic. Wayland leaving others behind. I think it's a very interesting subject, and it's something that I think does deserve to be talked about because now some of you might know that I run Linux Mint, and so I still run X11. Even though they are working on the Wayland session, it's not quite there yet. I've used it. It's getting there. It ain't there yet. I log on to get my work done, to play video games, and then I'll log off for the day. X still does that better in my situation. Now, that's not necessarily everybody's take on this, right? And I've been lambasted by Wayland shills. I've been lambasted by X shills. I am neither of those things. I am an average dude doing average things, and I just want it to work. And because Cinnamon doesn't have the Wayland support that I need, I'm not using Wayland. But I'm not changing distros to use Wayland. There's key points in all this. And I don't think that this is something that should surprise anybody. You can't support all the things all the time, or you just end up supporting nothing well at all. And not just Wayland, but in many subjects, right? You can't do everything all the time, or you'll be good at nothing. And it's also clear that Wayland still leaves a lot to be desired sometimes when you're trying to get the job done. Should we care, though, that some are being left behind? So if we go back to where it all started, as far as I've been able to tell, the Wayland display server is something that started development by a Red Hat developer. And I apologize, I'm going to butcher your name. We're just going to go with Christian. I believe it's Christian Hogsberg, but I could be wrong. And that was circa 2008. Now, I am going off Wikipedia here. Digging in and getting information is not really my strong suit, but that's the closest date that I could find. And it seems like to me, it made everything work a lot better and more similar to each other. The only exception to this appears to just be window managers, but I'm going to touch on that later because window managers are almost their own bullet point. It's FOSS pointed out in an article titled "To Wayland or to Not," as of course that is the question. And this article is from a few years ago, but it essentially dove into where the Cinnamon desktop of my beloved green distro, Linux Mint, had started working on an experimental Wayland session very quietly and in the background, and exposed it as an experimental session that year to kind of bring forward the work that they had been doing. It's not like they had been putting tons of effort into it because Wayland was still coming, but there hadn't been a death date for X yet at that point. However, once the considered death of X had been set in stone, Mint, like many of the other distros, started taking a look and going, oh, I need to actually do something about this. So they had quietly been working alongside their own X11 session, and I believe through all the notes that I've looked through, Mint 23, based upon Ubuntu 26.04, is about the time they're hoping to show both sessions as kind of a one-to-one, or more or less one-to-one, and display them alongside each other with the Mint Wayland session not necessarily being an experimental session. Not defaulted to, but being available. Yeah, the plan was to allow the X11 session to serve the community while the Wayland session gets the spit and polish that it needs to be ready for the general consumer. However, many outlets, YouTubers, and other people that I've talked to have blasted the Mint team for ignoring Wayland up until that point because, of course, everything's got to be Wayland right now, and you must dumpster X and kill it with fire. The rollout of Wayland is kind of a mixed bag. I think it really depends on your situation, the distro, how it's being handled, how it's being packaged, and how bleeding edge you wanted to really be. The Linux Cast, in a recent podcast with Brody Robinson, actually discussed this topic and how some desktops are slower to adopt than others and how the rollout has been handled by different groups. Again, this goes back to Wayland put the pressure on developers to make it work, not the Wayland devs to make it work. The general consensus from that was that GNOME, and Fedora for that matter, was moving pretty quickly to ditch X11 as fast as possible, even at the detriment to the user experience. And to be fair, maybe that's okay for Fedora. To be fair, Fedora is kind of the Red Hat. I don't want to say Red Hat's bitch, because I don't think that's quite the right term, but it is the testing ground for Red Hat. So a lot of decisions made in Fedora are very cutting edge to move the desktop along and to move Linux in a general direction. And if you're okay with experiencing that, then fine. Dogfooding your own stuff is a great way to fix things and get a good user experience because, well, users have a poor tolerance for shitty software. Unless you're an Arch user, in which case you're just used to it. Though I largely don't think that will be the case because X-Wayland is the crutch we need for the foreseeable future to retain some backwards compatibility. As a note, I ended up talking a little bit with Just a Guy Linux. He actually kind of asked this question in a hangout that we were in, and I replied yes. X-Wayland is a crutch. It is something that does need to exist because backwards compatibility is important. The user experience... let me back up. One of the reasons I use Linux Mint is the user experience is prioritized over pretty much everything. It needs to be a good experience or they're not going to ship it. And that's why X is still the default. X is still the better user experience than the Wayland session. So in this aspect, if something isn't good enough for Clem and the Mint team, they're not going to ship it. So they're working on Wayland. They're working on getting that support, but it's not to their standard yet, so why ship it? That's a totally different mentality. And that's also a similar... It used to be the mentality of Canonical, but Canonical just ships things now. But Canonical on the enterprise market leans that way. It needs to work or it doesn't ship. Well, Canonical is freaking out at the moment because GNOME is making decisions that are going to drastically affect the next LTS, which was looking to ship GNOME 50. And that version of GNOME is deciding to banish X to the pits of hell. GNOME 49 is looking to disable launching an X session with the ability to compile the desktop and the login manager to allow X to be able to work and to be able to launch X sessions. But for the most part, they're pretty much taking it behind the woodshed. Ubuntu was hoping to get one last ride with X11 on an LTS distribution and then dropping support. So they have 4 years to figure out all the aches and bruises of Wayland so that the enterprise gets the best experience. What's going to happen? Well, I got to be honest, I honestly don't know. I have it in my notes here that Canonical has been known to ship outdated packages before, and they'll probably do it again.
Yeah, editor me from the future, Canonical is actually dropping X11 on the next LTS, so take that for what you will.
That's how GNOME works. They don't like to work with other people. They just want to do their thing and leave us alone. My experiences on non-NVIDIA hardware, playing with Wayland, my issues aren't necessarily with Wayland. It's with the desktop not being fully featured. Things the devs haven't thought about I'm doing, and I'm breaking the desktop as a result. And a lot of that has come a long way. See, in 2015, if you tried to use Wayland, you might as well slit your wrists. But you use it these days, it's pretty much there. There are things that don't exist, and I do think in deprecating X, the Linux desktop will take a step backwards. Mostly because there will be edge cases that needed X that Wayland doesn't have an equivalent feature of. It's something they're going to have to work out. It's not something that you or I can do other than complain to our developers of, hey, we need these features. We need to work on these features. This still boils back to Wayland shifted the development burden to the Wayland, from the Wayland devs to the app developers. Wayland is just a protocol to follow. Apps have to rebuild themselves to work with Wayland. If an app doesn't support Wayland, it doesn't work with Wayland. X Wayland is only existing as a crutch because app developers aren't going to rebuild for Wayland, at least not today. Maybe 5 years from now, 10 years from now, whatever that number is, they need backwards compatibility. Wayland itself has 0 backwards compatibility. X Wayland is the backwards compatibility. And from what I have seen and read and talked to people, it's effectively a start from ground zero. You're not totally rewriting the app, but anything related to the back end sort of things is a total rewrite. Wayland does nothing like what X did, for good and for worst. And I've got some other thoughts too. Because Wayland didn't come out and set the standards for everything. They didn't set the portal standards. They didn't come out and say, you need to do things in this way or that way. They left it up to the desktops and window managers to build their own compositors based upon the Wayland standard. And there's a glaring problem here. As there is in the Linux community, there's a lot of divisive opinions. There's also a lot of choice for a reason, a lot of forks, a lot of scattered thoughts, right? This is where I feel like Wayland has kind of fallen under what X was able to achieve. Because, I mean, effectively, X is X, no matter where you put it. Wayland is not necessarily Wayland desktop to desktop, and I don't mean that in a literal sense. GNOME's Wayland isn't going to work the same way that KDE's Wayland's going to work. If you designed an app purely to work with KDE's Wayland, and you drop it in GNOME's Wayland, it probably will work right, but there's no guarantee, because they could have implemented things differently, and that will cause bugs. Because the way that Wayland is being handled, the display is being handled, is not necessarily the same desktop to desktop. Like I said, this is kind of a spot where I feel like Wayland has kind of lost, because Cinnamon on Wayland is not going to be the same as XFCE on Wayland when that happens, which won't be the same as GNOME or KDE or any other desktop. So every desktop will even furthermore have its own quirks, and how some apps might be developed to use a particular feature. Well, if that desktop doesn't have that feature, you're screwed. So, and finally, we're going to get into some of my own thoughts, my actual opinions here. I want to be clear. I do not hate Wayland. I think it is a very, very good thing for Linux, and it's a good thing that apps are being developed in a secure way. You know, X was developed basically as a keylogger.
Hey! Hey, get out of here! This is our yard! You don't belong there! Don't you touch anything! I told you all this yesterday!
Every app can see every keystroke you do. So any app could be coded to basically be a keylogger. There are security problems with this. X also did a number of other things, like you could forward windows through to another system. There's just all kinds of crazy stuff. If you get on YouTube and look up things that the X Windows system can do, it's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating what X can do. A lot of it's stuff I can agree isn't what it needs to do, right? Can we take a step back for a moment and ask this very question? Can somebody tell me what we're in a rush for? Like, I get it. We need to stop supporting 2 display servers, and I'm all on board for that. We need to move forward with what the future is. We can't forget about the past, but we need the future to come. But production stuff needs to be ready to rock. So when you update your production system, the new stuff keeps working without the user having to do a bunch of stuff to make their stuff work again. I want a functional system. I don't want to have questionable problems because of decisions made by some compositor, right? If my app from 5 years ago works, I paid the developer money for it, and I boot up a Wayland system and it just doesn't work because that dev didn't rebuild the entire app they spent 20 years making from scratch for Wayland, I'm going to use X to use that app. Now, I know X Wayland exists, and that's getting into the weeds here, but that's my point. Now, obviously, not every distro is made for production, and I'd argue Fedora is not really a production distro. I personally lump it in more with like the OpenSUSEs or the Arch Linuxes and other non-stable distros that are fun. They're great for testing software, and they're entertaining, maybe good for content, but aren't necessarily great for getting work done unless you're the kind of person that enjoys rolling up your sleeves and figuring out what's broken this week. You certainly can run it, and if it works for you, fantastic. Who am I to dictate your software? I'm speaking for myself here. Take that for what you will. If it's worth nothing to you, then ignore me. I don't know why you're still listening. See, to me, there's 3 main disconnects that I have currently with Wayland and how things are going to be done, because it does correspond in with the whole Windows 11 and Microsoft telling you to yeet your hardware into the trash and get better hardware. So the first point is desktop support. And yes, this is really mostly sorted out at this point, but things like Linux Mint and the Cinnamon desktop don't fully support Wayland yet. Sure, they're late to the party, but they also ensure your users are having a good time, and that does take longer if you do it right. They're not the only desktop, though. There's stuff like Mate, XFCE, and Budgie. They're not there yet either. As I said before, multiple blog posts meant, plans to have their Wayland session brought up to par, and they are working on it. They have a Trello board. You can go look at it if you want to. And that's all that matters for me is, I have this gut feeling that when Mint does release a Wayland session, it'll be good. And that's all that matters. They're not going to release something that's not done. And that isn't the case for some desktops. And this is why I think it makes me wonder how hard X is being dropped is going to affect them. XFCE barely has a compositor. That it doesn't even have full support. Like, it's just barely happening. As far as I know, Mate has done nothing. Or they tell you to use a different compositor. If I'm wrong, correct me in the comments, but I don't know if Mate is even going to survive the transition to Wayland. Budgie is a whole disaster. It has been for a long time. It is a cool desktop, and if you do run it or like it, sound off in the comments. You guys are crazy, but I do love the idea of Budgie. It's heavily based off the GNOME stack, and I can tell you that the Budgie developers have talked about moving toolkits, and this will probably make them move toolkits. Because they're going to lose X support and be forced onto Wayland. And from what I've seen in their notes, it's going to go full tilt. You're going to go from X to Wayland. There's going to be no transition. It either works or it doesn't. And that gets me into a point that probably makes more sense to you than my first point. Hardware support. Now, you may be asking yourself, as I've been pointed out to recently, why care about electro waste? As I was told by somebody recently when I had an older system that was having some issues with Wayland and I had to go back to X, they were like, just throw it in the trash and buy hardware that works correctly. I've had multiple people tell me my living room PC has a GTX 1070 because it still gets the job done. And I've had multiple people, even just yesterday, tell me, just throw it in the trash, go buy a 9070 XT and be happy.
What? What the fuck?
Bro, I'm not spending $800 to $1,000 on a fucking graphics card that will do the same job this graphics card does. It still works. It games just fine. It does stuff just fine. Look at this HP Envy. It's got an older GeForce MX graphics card in it. It edits and Resolve beautifully. It does just fine. It does recording just fine. Should I eat this in the trash and go get something else? Because you can't buy a laptop with a dedicated GPU that has fucking AMD graphics, pretty much, unless you buy an all AMD machine. And there's known bugs with AMD on AMD where the display will get confused and Linux will kernel panic. So that's not an option. And like I said, more than one person has done that statement of just get better hardware and throw out the old e-waste you're using. And this is odd because, like, why does the compositor affect my hardware driver so much? Well, full stop. That's not how Wayland works. Remember back to my comment, Wayland puts the burden on the developers rather than themselves. Apps, drivers, and software have to be rewritten with Wayland in mind. Think about that. NVIDIA's driver is very old, backwards, and very much from a time of 10 years ago in terms of a lot of the back end of it. The NVIDIA X settings has a fraction of the settings when you boot into Wayland. Even I've messed with it before. And they had tons of bugs, display crashes, and things like that. Why? Their driver was explicitly written for X. It had no Wayland support for a long, long time. Unless you're running the driver past about 550, so I think about 555 or 560, you don't have any Wayland support, and your drivers will just suck on Wayland, if they even work at all. Even AMD has ish and a lot of asterisks. AMD GPU works pretty good. I've got a 6950 XT in my main editing machine here that I also game on. Works perfectly fine, Wayland or X. It doesn't care. Why? AMD put the effort into making AMD GPU compatible with Wayland, and it probably took a lot of work to get there. And AMD is also the bread and butter of open source if you talk to more than one FOSS advocate. What about legacy AMD products? Yeah, what about devices that were made before AMD GPU was a thing? And that would be talking before 2015. You know, fairly old devices, but they probably still work as a display adapter. Yeah, especially those devices from the mid-2010s aren't so lucky. Devices like dedicated GPU in my Latitude E5570, which I just did a video on my channel, the dedicated graphics in that machine is a 2 gig dedicated card. Easily does Kden Live work just fine. It's a 6th Gen i7 high output model. It does a pretty good job. The graphics card requires the Radeon driver, even though AMD GPU initial support was added in the first revision of the AMD GPU driver. They never finished the support for that generation of graphics. Because, well, if you do manage to force it like I did, it's horrendously unstable to the point of full lockups, kernel panics, and crashes. If you use Radeon, well, the Radeon driver, as you'd expect, was written in the dark ages, and I'm pretty sure it was probably written by ATI at some point before AMD bought them. You know, they had proprietary drivers even back then. kind of company, and NVIDIA was the one that had open drivers. Think about that for a second. And Radeon has no Wayland support, because why would it? It's not even developed anymore. It's an old driver. It's like trying to use a driver that's not even supported anymore, much like the older NVIDIA cards. So I have another device too that I just had out the other day, is an HP EliteBook 8470p. It also carries an ancient AMD graphics driver. It's an Intel 2nd gen system that is forced to be on the Radeon driver, and that one has no support on AMD GPU at all, which means that hardware can't even run Wayland. If you do get it working, it's such a horrible experience that you might as well just install Windows. And even that, it'd probably be too slow. But it runs on X just fine. It doesn't have any issue. And, as I stated before, NVIDIA cards that don't support at least the 555 driver or higher, 550 and older, also don't really have Wayland support. And so I've got multiple machines like a ThinkPad T420 and a W520 that run on the 390 drivers. I've got a friend of mine who has a W530 that has a 470 driver that he uses. That's not Wayland compatible either. And sure, arguments can be made whether or not you should be using such hardware in this day and age. That point was even brought up with one of Brody Robinson's recent videos, where the dev behind NVK was baking in 10 series support for bringing Vulkan to NVIDIA drivers that are the open source stack, not the proprietary stack. And I get it. Even my 10 series is 9 years old, approaching 10 years old. But Linux has always supported older hardware, especially for those machines who can still get the job done. Your PC, probably even as far back as the mid-2000s, likely can still browse the net. Core 2 Duos can still get this job done if you got a little patience. And your grandmother probably isn't going to notice a modern Core i9 and a Pentium from 10 years ago, because Facebook loads and that's all she cares about. Window managers are an area that I think is not being talked about, and the only ones talking about it are those that are using them. Sure, Wayland compositors exist, but window managers like the big staples that you hear, the Awesome WM, the BSP WM, DWM, i3, those don't support Wayland. And from what I can tell, they probably never will. Maybe they'll be run in some bastardized way on X Wayland with a Wayland compositor on top of them. But if you want a window manager on Wayland, I mean, your choices are like what? Sway, Hyperland? Maybe there's, I guess DWL is a thing, but what I've heard, it's really bad. So the window manager guys either have to go full or none. And so I don't know what these guys are going to do. I don't know what these projects are going to do. It's something that is definitely going to have to just see what happens in the future. So what can I do? Well, not a whole lot, to be honest. X11 is dying. Regardless on which side of the aisle you're on, X11 is dying. Minus X Wayland development, there is no development going. It is completely unmaintained. Wayland is the future. You can trace X back to the 1980s with green screens and monochrome text. If you go back far enough, even past the X386 and all the way back to the beginning, to the original X windowing system. It's amazing. We've expanded it, we've forked it, we've expanded it again, and it's crazy that it can do what it can. And I'm still an avid user of the Cinnamon desktop with the X11 system. There's still a way to go for many desktops, and GNOME firing X11 for its 49 release and taking it behind the woodshed for version 50 is a turning point. RHEL is shipping without X. It feels weird. In my testing, GNOME and KDE seem to work pretty well. And that's kind of the point here, is I don't think you should necessarily choose Wayland or X. You should use what your distro ships. That is a good experience for you. If they ship both, use whichever one you want. Wayland is not that bad. My gripes are largely not necessarily Wayland, but incomplete feature sets for these desktops. And I gotta be real, I hate duopolies. GNOME and KDE, neither one really fit my needs. KDE is as buggy as all get out and has constantly caused me issues with crashing, lockups, functions just not working correctly, so on and so forth, and having so many buttons that you just get lost in the settings panel. GNOME, on the other hand, is like the meme. It's allergic to features as old of a joke as time, but it really is kind of true. They implement things the way they want to, and they strip back features to assume the user doesn't need them or needs a simple experience. But it's so simple that to do basic things, you need to extend the desktop. Neither of these work well for me, so at the end of the day, where am I at? Well, I use what works. Cinnamon will reach Wayland at some point, and at that point I will use it. And trust me, you'll hear about it. And honestly, at the end of the day, the best thing I think we all can do is to support our devs. Support them where you can and continue to improve on the projects you care about. I want Linux to succeed, and I want Linux to continue to work for me. I hope y'all enjoyed my little bit of a rant. This is a little bit of a different kind of video for me. Hopefully it was entertaining for you. Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.